Martha Whitfield had been left at the altar 3 times. The first time, the man said she was too quiet. The second, too plain. The third, just last Saturday, Thomas Brennan had stood before God and the entire town of Cedar Ridge and declared her unsuitable for a man of his station. He meant she was too large. At 300 pounds, Martha was the town's tragedy, its cautionary tale. Mothers whispered her name to their daughters. Men looked through her as if she were glass. She spent her days in Henderson's general store, helping radiant young brides pick out fabric for their wedding dresses, each yard of silk a fresh cut on her own unworn heart. Loneliness was a heavy coat she couldn't take off. Then came Ezra Stone. He was a man built of mountains and shadow who lived alone in the high country where civilized folk didn't go. They said he was as big as a bear and twice as wild. But when he came down for supplies and saw the way the town treated Martha, something ancient and protective woke up inside him. An anger that had been sleeping for 5 long years. He didn't care about their rules. He didn't care about their judgments. He only saw a good woman being crushed by a cruel world, and he decided to do something about it. What happens when a man who has lost everything decides that one person is worth fighting for? The answer would tear Cedar Ridge apart and change both of their lives forever. The morning sun cut through the dusty windows of the general store, but it brought no warmth to Martha. She ran her hands over a bolt of blue wool, the same color as the dress she'd worn to the harvest dance, the dress that now felt like a shroud. "Morning, Mrs. Patterson," Martha called out, her voice a practiced melody of cheer she didn't feel. The banker's wife swept in, trailing the scent of lavender and judgment. "Oh, Martha, dear." That tone, the one reserved for a stray dog or a sick child. "I do hope you're feeling better well, after Saturday's unpleasantness." Unpleasantness. Thomas Brennan's public crucifixion of her character, her worth, her body, was an unpleasantness. Like a spot of spilled tea, the words still echoed in her memory, sharp and brutal. "A woman who doesn't suit my station." "I'm quite well, thank you," Martha replied, her voice smooth as polished stone. She had learned long ago that to show pain was to invite the vultures. Mrs. Patterson clucked her tongue, her eyes scanning a rack of expensive silks. "Perhaps it's for the best, dear. Some men simply require a certain appearance. You understand." Martha understood perfectly. She understood that in a town like Cedar Ridge, a woman's worth was measured in inches, and she had far too many of them. The bell above the door chimed, and a whirlwind of blonde curls and happy laughter blew in. It was Sarah Mitchell, barely 19 and glowing with the kind of effortless beauty that made men forget their own names. "Martha, oh Martha, the most wonderful thing has happened." Sarah danced across the worn floorboard, her eyes shining like spring violets. "James proposed last night under the old oak. We're to be married in June." A vice squeezed Martha's heart, but her smile was genuine. Sarah had always been kind, a small island of grace in an ocean of cruelty. "How wonderful for you both. James is a good man." Sarah's face fell as she remembered. "Oh, I shouldn't be so excited. Not when I've just, what?" Martha cut her off gently, moving from behind the counter to wrap the younger woman in a hug. "Love is always something to celebrate, Sarah. Always." As Sarah chattered about her plans, Martha retreated into her familiar role, the helpful spinster, the keeper of other people's dreams. She fetched pattern books, suggested lace, calculated yardage. It was easier than thinking about the ivory gown hanging in her own wardrobe, the one she'd sewn with trembling hands for a wedding that never happened. The dress was a ghost in her closet. Later, upstairs in the small apartment her father had built for her mother 30 years ago, Martha stood before the mahogany wardrobe. Inside, wrapped in muslin, was the dress, a monument to her failure. Sometimes she thought she should burn it, but that would mean admitting all hope was gone, and she wasn't quite ready to surrender. Not completely. She moved to the window overlooking Main Street. There was the church where she'd been shamed, the hotel where she'd never have a wedding reception, the pitying faces behind lace curtains. Her world was a cage, and she was the only one who couldn't see the bars. 20 miles out, the mountains rose like sleeping giants. That's where he lived. Ezra Stone. The townsfolk were afraid of him. A hermit, nearly 7 feet tall, with wild hair and a beard that hid his face. He came to town for supplies, spoke few words, and left. But Martha had seen something they hadn't. She'd seen the intelligence in his dark eyes, the careful grace in his movements. She'd seen a pain that mirrored her own. He'd spoken to her once, months ago, to buy thread. His voice was like distant thunder, surprisingly gentle. "Much obliged, miss." For a moment she'd felt seen, not as a problem or a pity case, but as a person. It was a feeling so foreign she'd immediately dismissed it as foolishness. A sharp knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was her younger sister Elizabeth, her pretty face a mask of frustration. "Martha Jane Whitfield, you cannot hide up here forever. The whole town is talking." "The whole town is always talking, Elizabeth." "Thomas Brennan is a fool," Elizabeth declared, her skirts rustling with indignation. "But you must move on. There are other men who also have eyes." The words hung unsaid between them. "I won't be married out of pity," Martha said, her hands busy making tea. "It wouldn't be pity if you'd just—" Elizabeth stopped, but Martha could finish the sentence. "If you just lose weight, if you just try harder, if you just be someone else." "I'm tired of trying to fit into spaces that weren't made for me," Martha said quietly. Elizabeth's expression softened. "I just want you to be happy." "I know, but my happiness can't depend on a man's approval." They drank their tea in silence, the unspoken truce heavy in the air. Then Elizabeth set down her cup. "There's something else," she said. "Mother received a letter from Aunt Clara's lawyer in Denver." Aunt Clara, their father's sister, a spinster who'd gone west 30 years ago and never looked back. "She's died, Martha, last month." Martha waited, her heart strangely still. "And she's left everything to you." The teacup rattled in its saucer. "To me? But why?" "The letter said she understood what it was like to be a woman alone. She wanted to give you choices she never had." Elizabeth leaned forward, her eyes wide. "It's a ranch, Martha. 300 acres in Colorado. A house, outbuildings, and enough money to live on." Freedom. The word was a spark in the darkness of Martha's life. A chance to escape. A chance to build a life on her own terms, far from the whispers and the pitying stares. A chance to finally breathe. But she had no idea that 100 miles away, in a different kind of wilderness, a man was carving a small wooden cross, his own heart a wasteland of grief. And their two lonely worlds were about to collide with the force of a summer storm. The harvest dance was a special kind of hell. Martha had promised herself she wouldn't go, but Elizabeth had insisted, pushing and prodding until Martha's resolve wore thin. "You have to show them you're not broken," she'd argued. But standing in the doorway of the church hall, clutching a basket of apple tarts, Martha felt more broken than ever. The fiddle music was a cheerful knife, twisting in her gut. Couples swirled across the floor, their laughter echoing in the spaces where her own happiness should have been. Her best blue dress, the one she'd let out twice, strained at the seams, a constant, humiliating reminder of her size. She found a seat along the wall, in the section reserved for spinsters and widows, the Wallflower Brigade. She could hear the whispers from the chairs beside her. Mrs. Patterson, of course. Such a shame about poor Martha. 3 times at the altar. You can't really blame the men, can you? "My herald says it's unseemly for a woman to let herself go so completely," her companion replied, not bothering to lower her voice. Heat flooded Martha's cheeks. She stared at the dancers, her hands clenched in her lap, her posture a fortress of forced indifference. Then a cold voice cut through the whispers. "Ladies." It was Thomas Brennan, her former fiancé. He stood over them, his pale eyes fixing on Martha. "Might I have a word with Miss Whitfield?" The music seemed to falter. Conversations died. Every eye in the room turned to watch. The drama had arrived. "I think not, Mr. Brennan," Martha said, her voice a quiet thread of steel. "Come now, Martha. Don't be stubborn." His tone was patronizing, the one he used when explaining things to a child. "I merely wish to apologize for any misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. The word was a lit match dropped on dry tinder. An anger she had buried for years began to smolder. There was no misunderstanding, she said, rising to her feet. You made your position quite clear. Now see here. He reached for her, his fingers closing around her wrist like a manacle. I'm trying to be a gentleman. You're causing a scene. She was. The whole room was watching. The fiddle had gone silent. This was her nightmare come to life. Let go of me, she said, trying to pull away. His grip tightened. I spoke hastily. Perhaps we could reconsider, with certain conditions, of course. Certain conditions, she could guess. A diet, a different wardrobe, a smaller, quieter version of herself. One that would fit neatly into his respectable life. Her temper, so long dormant, erupted. The only arrangement I'm interested in, she said, her voice ringing through the silent hall, is one where you remove your hand from my arm and we pretend we never met. His face darkened. You're being hysterical. This is precisely why no man wants you. You're unreasonable and ungrateful. I'm offering you respectability, despite your shortcomings. The word was a slap. Shortcomings. The room spun. She could see Elizabeth pushing through the crowd, trying to reach her, but it was too late. My shortcomings? Her voice rose, sharp and clear. The only shortcoming I see is my past willingness to marry a man who mistakes cruelty for honesty. She wrenched her arm free and pushed past him, fleeing toward the door, the whispers following her like a pack of wolves. The cool night air was a shock to her burning skin. She ran. Down Main Street, past the storefronts, her borrowed shoes clicking a frantic rhythm on the boardwalk. The fiddle music started up again behind her. The town's brief entertainment over, life resuming its normal course. Tears she hadn't allowed herself to cry now streamed down her face, hot and furious. She stumbled off the road onto a path leading into the foothills, needing only to get away. Away from the town, away from the pity, away from herself. The path grew steeper, her dress tearing on brambles. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Storm clouds boiled over the peaks. She should turn back, but the thought of facing those people again was more terrifying than any storm. Rain began to fall, cold and hard. The path turned to slick mud. Her foot slipped on a loose stone. She went down hard. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up from her ankle. She tried to stand, but her leg crumpled beneath her. Lost, hurt, alone. The storm broke with a vengeance, the rain a solid wall of water. She huddled under a pine tree, shivering, her ankle throbbing. This was it. This was how she would die, in a torn party dress, fleeing one last humiliation. Lightning split the sky, and in the brief, stark flash, she saw a shape moving through the trees. A large shape, a bear. Then darkness. The cold seeped into her bones. She began to drift, the pain fading into a dull, distant ache. She heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, closer. A voice cut through the roar of the storm, deep and concerned. Miss? Miss, can you hear me? A large form knelt beside her. Warm hands touched her face. Through a blur of rain and pain, she saw a bearded face framed by long, dark hair. She saw kind eyes filled not with pity, but with worry. It was him, Ezra Stone, the mountain man. Can't, she whispered through numb lips, can't go back. Strong arms lifted her as if she were a child. The world tilted and went dark. Her last thought was that no one had ever made her feel safe before, and the man doing it now was a stranger. She woke to the smell of pine smoke and the crackle of a fire. She was warm. She was dry. She was lying on a narrow bed, tucked under a pile of thick furs. Her torn, wet dress was gone, replaced by a large flannel shirt that smelled faintly of wood smoke and man. Slowly she opened her eyes. She was in a small, sturdy cabin. Log walls, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with books. You're awake. The voice came from a shadowed corner. Ezra Stone sat in a chair, whittling a piece of wood. In the warm firelight, he looked less like a wild hermit and more like a quiet giant. Thank you, she whispered. You saved me. You were hurt, he said, his voice a low rumble. Hurt people don't always make the best decisions. How's the ankle? She moved it and winced. Painful. Sprained good. I wrapped it. He stood and moved to the stove. You should eat. You've been out for the better part of a day. A day. My sister, the town, they'll be looking for me. Storm's been too fierce for search parties, he said, ladling rabbit stew into a wooden bowl. The rich smell made her stomach growl. He brought it to her, his movements careful in the small space. I know this ain't proper by town standards, Miss Whitfield, but you're safe here. You have my word. He knew her name. Of course he did. Cedar Ridge was a town of whispers, and she was its favorite subject. She took the bowl, her cold fingers wrapping around its warmth. He returned to his chair and his carving, giving her space. This man, this stranger, showed her more consideration than anyone she had ever known. How long have you lived here? She asked between spoonfuls. 5 years. His hand stilled. Came west after my wife and son died. The simple words landed with the weight of mountains. She had lost love to rejection. He had lost it to death. I'm sorry, she said softly. Fever took them both while I was away hunting, he said, his voice flat, emotionless. Came back to an empty house. Figured I didn't deserve to live among decent folks after that. A man should protect his family. You couldn't have known. I could have been there. He resumed carving, the knife stroke sharp, angry. She recognized the guilt. It was an old, familiar friend. The things you tell yourself you could have done differently. Sometimes terrible things just happen, she said carefully. It doesn't make them our fault. He looked up, his dark eyes intense. Wise words from someone who ran into a storm to escape a room full of gossips. The comment stung. That was different. That was cowardice. Was it? He challenged. Or was it a woman finally refusing to be treated like she was worthless? He set down his carving. I heard what that Brennan fellow said to you. Half the mountain heard him. The shame washed over her again. The whole town thinks I'm pathetic. The whole town is wrong. His voice was a low growl. Any man who treats a woman that way ain't worth the ground he walks on, and any town that finds sport in another's pain has lost its soul. No one had ever defended her like that, without condition, without a hint of pity. You don't even know me, she whispered. I've watched you in that store, Miss Whitfield. I've seen how you treat people with kindness, even when they don't deserve it. I've seen you help young brides plan their happiness, even when it must be tearing you apart. His eyes flashed. That's not the mark of a pathetic woman. That's the mark of a strong one. He had been watching her, and he hadn't seen her size. He had seen her character. Why? She asked, her voice trembling. Why are you being so kind to me? He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. Maybe, he said, his voice barely a whisper, because I know what it feels like to be judged for things you can't control. Maybe I recognize another soul carrying more pain than they deserve. He met her gaze. Or maybe it's just the right thing to do. Outside, the storm was finally passing. Inside, a different kind of storm was just beginning, one that would change everything. The next morning, Ezra was outside chopping wood when the riders came. Your sister's back, he said, stepping into the cabin, his expression grim. And she brought the preacher with her. Martha's stomach plummeted. Elizabeth and Reverend Morrison. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was an intervention. They burst into the cabin without knocking, their faces a mixture of horror and righteous indignation. They saw Martha in bed, wearing a man's shirt. They saw Ezra, the wild mountain man, standing protectively nearby. Oh, Martha, Elizabeth breathed. What have you done? I survived a storm with Mr. Stone's help, Martha replied, her voice cool. Miss Whitfield, the Reverend began, his voice dripping with disapproval. The appearance of impropriety is as damaging as impropriety itself. The town is talking. Your reputation. My reputation was already in ruins, Reverend, Martha cut him off. Mr. Stone, the preacher said, turning to Ezra, as a Christian gentleman, surely you understand, Miss Whitfield's honor must be satisfied. Miss Whitfield's honor is intact, Ezra said, his voice a low growl that made the preacher take a step back. Anyone who says otherwise can answer to me. No one is questioning your character, Mr. Stone, Elizabeth said quickly. But Martha can't simply return to town as if nothing happened. The scandal. I won't be pushed into a marriage to save appearances. Martha said firmly. You may not have a choice, the Reverend said bluntly. The town council met this morning. If you don't marry, and soon, they're prepared to ask you to leave Cedar Ridge. An ultimatum, exile. Ezra tensed beside her, his hands clenching into fists. Then I suppose I'll leave, Martha said, the word surprising even herself. Elizabeth gasped. Martha, you can't be serious. Where would you go? I have options, she said, her voice growing stronger. She thought of Aunt Clara's letter, of the ranch, of freedom. I've inherited property in Colorado, a ranch, enough to live on independently. The silence in the cabin was deafening. The preacher's jaw dropped. Elizabeth stared, dumbfounded. The power in the room had just shifted, dramatically. The town council's decision stands, the Reverend sputtered, trying to regain control. You have 2 weeks to conclude your business and depart. That's more than enough time, Martha said, a smile touching her lips for the first time in days. After they left, a new fragile hope filled the small cabin. You're really going to do it, Ezra said, his voice filled with something that sounded like admiration. I'm really going to do it, she confirmed. 2 weeks, to pack up a lifetime. I can help, he offered. The journey to Colorado can be dangerous for a woman alone. I know the territory. She looked at him, this man who had saved her, defended her, and now offered to guide her to a new life. Why? Why would you do this for me? He looked at the row of small wooden crosses on his mantelpiece. Maybe because helping someone else find a new life is easier than figuring out my own, he said softly. He met her eyes. Or maybe because for the first time in 5 years, I feel like I have something useful to contribute to the world. The idea of traveling with him sent a nervous flutter through her. People would talk. The scandal would grow. People are already talking, he said, reading her thoughts. At least this way, you'll be too far away to hear them. A rare, wry smile touched his lips. All right, she said, the word a leap of faith. Yes, I accept your help. His smile widened, transforming his stern face. Then we'd better get you back to town. We've got a new life to arrange, Miss Whitfield. As they walked back towards Cedar Ridge, Martha knew the woman returning was not the same one who had fled. The old Martha had been a creature of fear and apology. This new Martha was just beginning to discover her own strength, and she was walking towards a future she would build with her own 2 hands. Returning to Cedar Ridge was like walking into her own funeral. Whispers followed her down Main Street. Windows became frames for judgmental eyes. The town had already convicted her in the court of public opinion. Mr. Henderson met her at the store, his expression pained. Martha, with all the talk, the town council, I'm afraid I have to let you go. She had expected it, but it still stung. Her apartment felt small and suffocating. She began to pack, sorting through the remnants of a life that no longer fit her. She gave her never-worn wedding dress to a grateful Sarah Mitchell. She sold her fussy furniture. Each item she discarded was a chain she was breaking. Elizabeth came, her eyes red from crying. Martha, please reconsider. To travel with that man, people are saying terrible things. People have always said terrible things about me, Elizabeth, Martha replied. At least now I'll be too far away to hear them. Mr. Stone is a good man. He treats me with respect. That's more than I can say for anyone else in this town. 3 days into her preparations, Ezra appeared at her door. He looked different. In town clothes, with his hair tied back, he was no longer the wild hermit, but a man of quiet power. I've made inquiries about the route, he said, his tone serious. There's been trouble. Bandits. It's not safe for a woman alone. He hesitated. People will assume we're courting. It might make things easier if we don't correct them. A pretense. A charade. The idea was a cold knife in her heart. She just escaped the marriage trap, and now she was being asked to pretend to be in it. But he was right. It was practical. There's a church social tonight, she said, her voice brittle. If we're going to establish this fiction, we should be seen together. That evening, they walked into the church hall, and a hush fell over the room. Martha, on the arm of the mountain man. It was the scandal of the year. Ezra played his part perfectly. He was attentive, protective, his hand on the small of her back a constant, warm presence. He deflected intrusive questions with quiet humor and defended her against the veiled barbs of Reverend Morrison with a sharp intelligence that left the preacher speechless. He spoke of his late wife, Sarah, with a deep and abiding love. She always saw people's hearts, not their circumstances, he said, his gaze on Martha. I think she would have liked you very much. The words should have been a comfort. Instead, they were a confirmation of her deepest fear. He wasn't seeing her. He was seeing an echo of his dead wife. His kindness wasn't for her, Martha, but for the woman she reminded him of. She was a charity case, a substitute, a way for him to assuage his own guilt. The realization was a bucket of ice water. I should be getting home, she said, her voice tight. At her door, she turned to him. Thank you for the performance, Mr. Stone. You played your part perfectly. I hope it wasn't too difficult, pretending to have feelings for someone like me. His face hardened in the moonlight. Is that what you think this is? A performance? Isn't it? She shot back, her hurt making her cruel. A practical arrangement? Or perhaps you're just being kind because I remind you of her? The silence stretched between them, sharp and painful. I see, he said finally, his voice cold and distant. Then perhaps it's best if we keep things strictly practical from now on. He stepped back. We'll leave at first light on Thursday. Good night, Miss Whitfield. He was gone. She leaned against her closed door, the tears she refused to shed burning behind her eyes. She had gotten what she asked for. A business arrangement, no emotional complications. So why did it feel like she had just lost everything? Her last morning in Cedar Ridge dawned gray and wet. She was packing the last of her things when a sharp knock echoed through the empty apartment. It wasn't Ezra. It was a stranger, a well-dressed man with keen eyes and a leather satchel. Miss Martha Whitfield? He asked, his voice crisp. I am Harrison Mitchell, attorney from Denver. I represent the estate of your aunt, Clara Whitfield. Mr. Mitchell, I wasn't expecting you until we reached Denver. An urgent matter has arisen, he said, stepping inside. There have been complications with your inheritance. Complications? The word sent a chill down her spine. He opened his satchel and pulled out a sheaf of legal documents. Your aunt, shortly before her death, added a codicil to her will. He paused, his expression grave. She was aware of your social difficulties here in Cedar Ridge. The humiliation was a fresh slap. Even from the grave, her failures haunted her. She was concerned for your welfare, the lawyer continued. She believed that life on the frontier would be too difficult for a woman alone. He handed her a document. She scanned the dense legal text, her eyes catching on a few key phrases. Marriage requirement, within 1 year, to a husband of suitable character, approved by the estate trustees. Her blood ran cold. This can't be right, she whispered. It says I have to get married. Within 1 year of taking possession of the property, Mitchell confirmed, if you fail to do so, the entire estate is forfeited to charity. The room began to spin. It was a trap, a gilded cage. She had run from one prison only to find herself facing another. Her dream of independence was a mirage. And who are these trustees who get to approve my husband? 3 prominent Denver businessmen, friends of your aunt. So I have to find a man willing to marry me and then convince 3 strangers he's worthy? She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. I suggest you approach it as a business arrangement, the lawyer said, not unkindly. Find a practical partner. Buy a husband. That's what he meant. Just then, a heavy knock announced Ezra's arrival. He walked in, his face set in the cool, distant lines he'd worn since their argument. He saw her face, the documents in her hand. What's wrong? She couldn't speak. She just pointed to the papers. He read them, his expression growing darker with every line. When he looked up, his face was grim. They stood in silence, the rain drumming against the window pane, the sound of her future washing away. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. Marry me. She stared at him, certain she had misheard. What? Marry me, he repeated. It's a business arrangement, a partnership. You need a husband to claim your inheritance. I need a reason to rejoin the world. We can help each other. The offer hung in the air between them. It was practical. It was logical. It was a perfect solution, and it was the most heartbreaking thing she had ever heard. No romantic expectations, he continued, his voice carefully neutral. Just mutual respect and shared goals. She would get her ranch, her freedom, but she would be chained to a man who felt nothing for her but a sense of duty, a man who was only marrying her to solve a problem. The trustees would have to approve you, she managed to say. I can provide references, he said, his confidence unwavering. I have experience managing property. I am educated and responsible. I will be everything they are looking for. A marriage of convenience, a loveless contract. It was everything she had been running from, and it was her only hope. This is sudden, she whispered. We should marry before we leave for Colorado, he said, all business. Present ourselves to the trustees as an established couple. Reverend Morrison can perform the ceremony tomorrow morning. Tomorrow, less than 24 hours to decide the rest of her life. He saw the turmoil on her face. Think about what you really want, Martha, he said, his voice softening for the first time. Not what you think you should want. What would actually make you happy? After he left, she sat alone in the empty room, the legal documents feeling like stones in her hands. Was a life of lonely independence on her own ranch better than a life of partnership with a man she respected, but who could never love her? She had no good choices, only hard ones, and she had until morning to make a decision that would seal her fate. The ceremony was a blur. Martha stood beside Ezra in the cold, empty church, her sister Elizabeth weeping silently in the front pew. Reverend Morrison read the vows with the enthusiasm of a man officiating a hanging. She said, I do. Her voice was clear and strong. A business decision, a necessary step. He said, I do. His voice was a low, steady rumble that seemed to shake the very floorboards. He slid a simple gold band onto her finger. It felt heavy, foreign. Then the preacher said, You may kiss the bride. Ezra turned to her. His dark eyes were unreadable. He leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was brief, chaste, a mere formality. But for a fleeting moment, she felt a spark of warmth, a flicker of something she couldn't name. And then it was over. They were husband and wife. As they prepared to leave for the train station, Thomas Brennan appeared, his face a storm of rage and disbelief. Madness, Martha. You're throwing your life away on this savage, just to spite me. Before she could respond, Ezra stepped between them. His voice was deadly quiet. Mr. Brennan, you will address my wife with respect, or you will not address her at all. My wife. The words hung in the air, a shield around her. Your wife? Thomas sneered. I suppose she finally found a man desperate enough to have her. This time Martha spoke. Her voice was calm but sharp as a razor. I got exactly what I wanted, Thomas. A man who sees my strengths, not my shortcomings. A man who chose me, not one who settled for me. She looked him in the eye. I'm sorry that's a concept you can't understand. Ezra offered her his arm. Shall we go, Mrs. Stone? Mrs. Stone. The name felt strange but not unwelcome. She took her husband's arm and walked away from Cedar Ridge, and never looked back. The meeting with the trustees in Denver was an interrogation. Three stern-faced men in expensive suits firing questions at them for 2 hours. They questioned the haste of their marriage. They questioned Ezra's background. They questioned Martha's ability to manage a ranch. But Ezra was prepared. He presented letters of reference and spoke with a quiet authority and knowledge that astonished Martha. He knew about cattle markets, water rights, crop rotation. He was far more than a simple mountain hermit. And when they asked her what drew her to him, she spoke the simple truth. My husband, she said, looking at Ezra, is the first man who has ever seen me as I am and chosen me anyway. He doesn't want to change me or manage me. He simply wants to build something with me. In my experience, that is a rarer gift than passion. The honesty of her words, combined with Ezra's quiet competence, won them over. The inheritance was hers. Theirs. As they left the office, stepping out into the bright Denver sunlight, Martha felt a dizzying sense of relief. She had done it. She was free. We did it, she breathed. You did it, he corrected gently. Your courage convinced them. The train ride to the small frontier town of Millfield was different. They were no longer strangers, but partners in a shared venture. They planned the division of labor on the ranch, the finances, the future. They even discussed the sleeping arrangements. The house has 4 bedrooms, Ezra said, his eyes on the passing landscape. We can each have our own space, unless you would prefer otherwise. The choice was hers. He was giving her space, respecting her boundaries. She agreed to separate rooms, even as a small, lonely part of her wished he had argued. The ranch was more beautiful than she could have imagined. A solid 2-story house sat on a rise overlooking a vast, green valley, a river snaking through it like a silver ribbon. Mountains stood like ancient guardians on the horizon. It was a place big enough for any dream. "It's magnificent," she whispered. They stood together on the porch of their new home, the silence of the wilderness a welcome balm. But the peace did not last. Within an hour of their arrival, a group of riders appeared, rough-looking men with guns on their hips and menace in their eyes. Their leader, a man named Garrett, had a smile that didn't touch his cold eyes. "You must be the new owners," he said, his gaze lingering on Martha in a way that made her skin crawl. "Hope you folks plan on being neighborly." The threat was veiled but clear. He spoke of water rights and cooperating, but his meaning was extortion. "Pay us for protection, or bad things will happen." "I think you gentlemen should leave," Martha said, her voice shaking only slightly. Garrett's smile vanished. "Mrs. Stone, this is rough country, dangerous for a woman alone. Accidents happen." Before he could say more, Ezra stepped forward. "My wife owns this property. Any interference with her peaceful enjoyment of it will be met with an appropriate response." "And what kind of response would that be?" one of the men sneered. "The kind that ensures it doesn't happen twice." The quiet deadliness in Ezra's voice gave them pause. Garrett and his men exchanged glances, then mounted their horses. "We'll be back," Garrett called out, "to see if you've reconsidered." As they rode away, Martha's knees felt weak. "Will they be back?" "Count on it," Ezra said, his face grim. He turned to her, his eyes serious. "Martha, there are things about my past I haven't told you." Over the next 3 days, the man she had married transformed. The gentle hermit disappeared, replaced by a seasoned tactician. He cleaned weapons she didn't know he had. He spoke of tactics and supply lines. "You were a soldier," she said, watching his practiced hands reassemble a rifle. "Officer," he corrected. "Union Army. Then I was a territorial marshal. I spent 15 years dealing with men like Garrett." "Is that why you were hiding in the mountains? From that life?" He stopped, his expression filled with a pain so deep it stole her breath. "I was hiding from the guilt. My wife and son, they died while I was away, chasing outlaws. I left them unprotected." He looked at her, his eyes raw. "This fight, Martha, it's not just about your ranch. It's about me proving I can still protect someone who matters." Someone who matters. A young man from town rode up with an urgent telegram. Ezra read it, and his face went pale. He handed it to her. The message was from an old marshal contact. "Garrett has sheriff in his pocket. Warrant being issued for your arrest. Fake charges, cattle theft. Move now or face jail." "They're going to arrest us," she whispered. "We need to run," Ezra said, already grabbing supplies. "Find somewhere safe to hide." "No." The word was quiet, but unshakable. It came from a place deep inside her she didn't know existed. "Martha, this isn't about courage. It's a trap. They want us to run." "And I won't do it," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I have spent my entire life running. From judgment, from rejection, from my own fear. I will not start my new life by running away. We will stand. We will fight." He stared at her, a look of stunned admiration on his face. "All right," he said, a slow smile spreading across his lips. "We make our stand here, but we do it smart." They worked through the night, preparing. The confrontation came with the dawn. The sheriff and a dozen of Garrett's men rode into their yard, a fake warrant in the sheriff's trembling hand. "Mrs. Stone, Mr. Stone," he stammered. You're under arrest." "On what grounds, Sheriff?" Ezra asked, his voice calm and steady as he and Martha stood together on the porch. "Cattle theft, destruction of property." "Interesting," Martha said, her own voice surprisingly clear, "since we only arrived 3 days ago." "The warrant is legal," Garrett snarled. "Justice must be served." "Justice indeed." A new voice cut through the tense standoff. 3 riders emerged from the trees behind the house. They wore the badges of U.S. Marshals. "Sheriff Morrison," the lead marshal said, his voice like iron, "you're under arrest for corruption. Garrett, you and your men are wanted for extortion." The reversal was instant and absolute. Garrett's face crumpled in defeat. As the marshals led the criminals away, their leader turned to Martha. "Mrs. Stone, your husband's telegram arrived just in time. We've been building a case against Garrett for months, but we needed a witness with the courage to stand up to him. Your refusal to run made this all possible." The danger was over. The valley was quiet again, bathed in the peaceful morning light. They were safe. They were free. Ezra turned to her, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't read. "Martha," he said, his voice rough, "I have to tell you something. I didn't marry you for practical reasons." She held her breath. "I lied. To you and to myself. I was afraid to risk my heart again. But watching you choose courage over safety, watching you become this powerful, incredible woman, I realized I was falling in love with you." The world stopped. "You love me?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "I love your courage," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your kindness, your strength. I love the woman who stood on this porch and faced down a dozen armed men to defend her home. I love you, Martha." The careful walls around her heart crumbled into dust. "I think," she said, tears blurring her vision, "I think I've been falling in love with you too. I was just too afraid to admit it." He closed the distance between them, his large hands gently cupping her face. Martha. Her name was a prayer, and when he kissed her, it was not the chaste, formal kiss of their wedding day. It was a kiss of fire and promise, of 2 broken souls finding their way home. A kiss that sealed not a contract, but a covenant, a new life, a real marriage, a love story that had begun not with a fairy tale, but with a storm, a partnership, and the quiet, stubborn courage of a woman who had finally learned her own worth. 6 months later, Martha stood on that same porch, her husband's arms around her, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. Her sister Elizabeth had come to visit, her eyes wide with amazement at the thriving ranch and the radiant happiness of the couple who ran it. "You're really in love," Elizabeth had said, a note of wonder in her voice. "Completely, ridiculously, permanently in love," Martha had replied with a laugh. The woman who had been left at the altar 3 times had finally found her place. She hadn't needed to become smaller or prettier or different. She had only needed to become herself. She had married for an inheritance and found a fortune. She had sought independence and found a partnership deeper than any she could have imagined. She had faced down her fears and found a love as vast and wild as the mountains themselves. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the stories we have coming your way are ones you won't want to miss.